The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the windows of the small antique shop tucked away in the corner of a forgotten street. The shop, Timeless Relics, was a cluttered maze of dusty shelves, cracked mirrors, and furniture that seemed to have been abandoned by time itself. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself for hours, sifting through the remnants of lives long past. Elliot Carter, a 28-year-old freelance journalist, had always been drawn to places like this. He had a knack for finding stories in the most unlikely of places, and tonight he was searching for inspiration. His latest assignment, a piece on urban legends, had led him here. The shop owner, an elderly man with a hunched back and a pair of thick glasses, had been reluctant to let him in so late, but Elliot's charm and a crisp $20 bill had persuaded him. As Elliot wandered through the dimly lit aisles, his flashlight beam flickered over the odd assortment of items. A porcelain doll with a cracked face stared back at him, its glassy eyes seeming to follow his every move. He shivered and moved on, his attention caught by an old rotary phone sitting on a shelf. It was a peculiar object, its black enamel chipped and faded, the cord frayed and brittle. The numbers on the dial were worn and the receiver felt heavy in his hand. Something about the phone called to him. It wasn't just its age or its unusual design, it was the feeling that it held a story, a secret waiting to be uncovered. Elliot glanced around, but the shop owner was nowhere to be seen. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to take it. After all, it was just an old phone. What harm could it do? He paid for the phone with the last of his cash and hurried home, the rain soaking through his coat. His apartment was small and cluttered, much like the shop he'd just left. He set the phone down on his desk and stared at it, a strange sense of anticipation bubbling up inside him. He didn't know why, but he felt like he'd stumbled onto something big. That night, as the storm raged outside, Elliot sat at his desk, the phone in front of him. He tried plugging it in, but it didn't seem to work. Just as he was about to give up and go to bed, the phone rang. The sound was jarring, a loud, mechanical trill that echoed through the quiet apartment. Elliot froze, his heart pounding. The phone wasn't plugged in. It couldn't ring. And yet it was. He reached for the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. "Hello," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, then a voice on the other end, a woman's voice, soft and trembling. Is this Elliot?" Elliot's breath caught in his throat. "Yes, this is Elliot. Who is this?" The woman hesitated. "My name is Clara. Clara Bennett. I think I'm in trouble." Elliot frowned. "What kind of trouble? How did you get this number?" There was a long silence, and for a moment, Elliot thought the call had dropped. Then Clara spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how I got this number. I just dialed and you answered. Please, you have to help me. Something terrible is going to happen." Before Elliot could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the receiver, his mind racing. Who was Clara Bennett? And how had she called him on a phone that wasn't even connected? He tried calling back, but the line was dead. The phone sat silent on his desk, its dark surface reflecting the flickering light of the storm outside. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something far beyond his understanding. Elliot spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, his mind racing with questions about the mysterious phone call. Who was Clara Bennett? How had she called him on a phone that wasn't even connected? And what kind of trouble was she in? By the time the sun rose, he had resolved to find answers. He started his investigation at the local library, searching through old newspapers and public records for any mention of Clara Bennett. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he found something, a small article from 1957. It was a brief notice about a young woman named Clara Bennett who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. According to the article, Clara had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a distraught family and a community in shock. Elliot's heart raced as he read the article. Could this be the same Clara Bennett who had called him? It seemed impossible, but the coincidence was too striking to ignore. He copied down the details and decided to dig deeper. His next stop was the local historical society, where he hoped to find more information about Clara and her family. The archivist, an elderly woman with a kind smile, listened patiently as Elliot explained his quest. She disappeared into the stacks and returned with a dusty box of old photographs and documents. The Bennetts were a prominent family in the area, she explained as she sifted through the contents of the box. Clara was their only daughter. Her disappearance was a great tragedy. Elliot's hands trembled as he examined the photographs. There she was, Clara Bennett, a young woman with dark hair and a shy smile. She looked exactly as he had imagined her based on her voice. He felt a pang of sadness as he realized that she had been just a few years younger than he was now when she vanished. Do you know what happened to her? Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The archivist shook her head. No one knows for sure. There were rumors, of course. Some said she ran away, others believed she was the victim of foul play. But the truth was never uncovered. Elliot thanked the archivist and left the historical society, his mind reeling. If Clara had called him from the past, how was that possible? And why had she reached out to him, of all people? He needed to know more. That evening, he returned to his apartment and sat down at his desk, the cursed phone in front of him. He stared at it, half expecting it to ring again. But it remained silent, its dark surface reflecting the dim light of his desk lamp. Just as he was about to give up and go to bed, the phone rang. Elliot's heart leapt into his throat. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the receiver. "Hello, Elliot." It was Clara's voice again, trembling and faint. "Thank God you answered. I don't have much time." "Clara, what's going on? Where are you?" Elliot asked, his voice urgent. I don't know. It's dark, and I can't see anything. I think I'm trapped. Please, you have to help me." Elliot's mind raced. "Clara, listen to me. I need you to tell me where you were before you got trapped. What's the last thing you remember?" There was a long pause, and Elliot could hear Clara's ragged breathing on the other end of the line. "I was at home," she said finally. "I was arguing with my father. He didn't want me to see someone. A man. I don't remember his name, but I was so angry. I left the house and then, I don't know, everything went black." Elliot's heart sank. He didn't know how to help her. He was talking to a woman who had disappeared over 60 years ago. How could he possibly intervene in a tragedy that had already happened? "Clara, he began, but before he could finish, the line went dead. Elliot slammed the receiver down in frustration. He felt helpless, trapped in a situation he couldn't understand. But he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He had to try to help her, even if it seemed impossible. The next morning, Elliot decided to visit the location where Clara had last been seen. According to the old newspaper article, she had disappeared near the edge of town, close to an abandoned factory. The area was now a rundown industrial park, but Elliot hoped he might find some clue that had been overlooked all those years ago. As he walked through the empty streets, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder several times, but there was no one there. Still, the sense of unease lingered. When he reached the factory, he found it locked and boarded up. The windows were shattered and the walls were covered in graffiti. It was a bleak, desolate place, but Elliot was determined to search it. He found a broken window and climbed inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The factory was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and crumbling walls. Elliot moved carefully, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. As he explored, he found something that made his blood run cold, a small, dusty room hidden behind a stack of old crates. In the center of the room was a chair, its legs bolted to the floor. The walls were covered in strange symbols and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Elliot's flashlight beam fell on something in the corner of the room, a small, tattered piece of fabric. He picked it up and examined it closely. It was a handkerchief embroidered with the initials CB Clara Bennett. Elliot's heart pounded as he realized what he had found. This was where Clara had been held. But by whom? And why? As he stood there, the cursed phone in his pocket began to ring. The ringing of the cursed phone echoed through the abandoned factory, its shrill sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Elliot's heart raced as he fumbled to pull the phone from his pocket. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the receiver before finally answering. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling. "Elliot," Clara's voice was faint, barely audible over the static. "You're close. I can feel it. Please hurry." "Clara, I'm here," Elliot said, his eyes darting around the room. "I'm in the factory. Where are you? What happened to you?" There was a long pause, and Elliot could hear Clara's shallow breathing on the other end of the line. "I don't know," she whispered. I remember running. I was so scared. And then pain. Everything went dark. I think he's still here." "Who's still here?" Elliot asked, his voice urgent. "Clara. Who took you?" Before she could answer, the line went dead. Elliot cursed under his breath and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He had to find her. He couldn't just leave her trapped in whatever nightmare she was living. He began to search the room more thoroughly, his flashlight beam sweeping over the walls and floor. The symbols etched into the walls seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if they were alive. Elliot felt a chill run down his spine as he realized they were some kind of ritual markings. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was something darker, something supernatural. In the corner of the room, he found a trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of debris. His hands shook as he cleared the rubble away and pulled the door open. A set of narrow, rusted stairs led down into the darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Elliot hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The darkness swallowed him whole, the beam of his flashlight the only thing keeping him from being completely lost. The stairs seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning as they led deeper underground. At the bottom, he found himself in a narrow tunnel. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. Elliot pressed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he couldn't turn back now. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, and what Elliot saw there made his blood run cold. The room was filled with old, rusted machinery, but it wasn't the machines that caught his attention. It was the bodies. Dozens of them scattered across the floor, their skeletal remains twisted and broken. Some were still clothed in tattered garments, while others were little more than bones. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Elliot's stomach churned as he realized what he was looking at. This was a place of death, a place where something unspeakable had happened, and Clara had been brought here. He moved closer to the altar, his flashlight beam illuminating the symbols carved into its surface. They were the same as the ones on the walls, but here they seemed to glow faintly as if they were still active. Elliot reached out to touch one, but before he could, the cursed phone rang again. He answered it without thinking. "Clara?" "Elliot," her voice was weaker now, barely a whisper. "You're here. I can feel you. But you have to leave. It's not safe." "He's coming." "Who's coming?" Elliot asked, his voice urgent. "Clara, tell me who did this to you." There was a long pause, and then Clara's voice came through, trembling with fear. His name is Alistair Graves. He's not human. He's something else. Something ancient. And he's coming for you." Before Elliot could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. Alistair Graves. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had to get out of there, but he couldn't leave without finding Clara. As he turned to leave the chamber, he heard a sound behind him, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The growl came again, closer this time, and Elliot's heart leapt into his throat. He ran, his footsteps echoing through the tunnel as he raced back toward the stairs. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and he could feel something closing in on him. He didn't dare look back. He just ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he climbed the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached the top, he slammed the trapdoor shut behind him and scrambled to his feet. The growling stopped, but the sense of dread remained. Elliot knew he wasn't safe. Not yet. He hurried out of the factory, the cursed phone clutched tightly in his hand. As he stepped out into the daylight, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. But it was short-lived. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this. He had to find out who or what Alistair Graves was and how he was connected to Clara. Back at his apartment, Elliot began to research the name. It didn't take long to find references to Alistair Graves in old newspapers and occult texts. Graves had been a prominent figure in the early 20th century, a wealthy industrialist with a dark secret. He was rumored to have dabbled in the occult, conducting rituals and experiments in search of immortality. According to the texts, Graves had disappeared in the 1950s, around the same time Clara had vanished. But there were whispers that he hadn't died, that he had achieved his goal and become something more than human. Something monstrous. Elliot's hands trembled as he read the accounts. If Graves was still out there, if he was the one who had taken Clara, then she might still be alive. Trapped in some kind of limbo, caught between life and death. And if that was the case, Elliot had to find a way to save her. But how? He was just a journalist, not a paranormal investigator. He didn't know the first thing about dealing with something like this. He needed help. As he sat there, staring at the cursed phone, it rang again. The cursed phone's ring was sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence of Elliot's apartment like a knife. He stared at it, his heart pounding. He didn't want to answer it, not after what he'd just learned about Alistair Graves. but he couldn't ignore it. Clara was counting on him. He picked up the receiver. "Hello? Elliot." Clara's voice was faint, barely audible over the static. "You have to stop him. He's coming for you. He knows you're looking for me." "Clara, I'm trying to help you," Elliot said, his voice urgent. "But I don't know how. Tell me what to do." There was a long pause, and Elliot could hear Clara's shallow breathing on the other end of the line. "There's a book," she whispered. "A book of rituals. It's the only thing that can stop him. But it's dangerous. If you use it, you could end up like me." Elliot's stomach churned. "Where is it?" "It's in his house," Clara said. "The old Graves mansion. But you have to be careful. He'll be waiting for you." Before Elliot could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. The Graves mansion. He'd heard of it before. An old, decaying estate on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades. If the book was there, he had to find it. But he couldn't do it alone. He grabbed his coat and headed out into the night, the cursed phone tucked into his pocket. He needed someone who knew about the occult, someone who could help him navigate the dangers he was about to face. There was only one person he could think of, Dr. Evelyn Cross, a professor of folklore and mythology at the local university. Elliot had interviewed Dr. Cross a few years ago for a piece on urban legends. She was sharp, knowledgeable, and, most importantly, she believed in the supernatural. If anyone could help him, it was her. He drove to her house, a small, ivy-covered cottage on the edge of campus. The lights were still on, and he could see her silhouette through the curtains. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened. Dr. Cross was in her late 50s, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked at Elliot with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Elliot, what are you doing here at this hour?" "I need your help," Elliot said, his voice urgent. "It's about Alistair Graves, Dr." Cross's expression darkened. "Come in." She led him into her study, a cozy room filled with books and artifacts from around the world. Elliot quickly explained everything: the cursed phone, Clara Bennett, the factory, and the ritual chamber. Dr. Cross listened intently, her face growing more serious with each passing moment. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "This is extraordinary. If what you're saying is true, then Alistair Graves is more dangerous than anyone realized." "Do you believe me?" Elliot asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Dr. Cross nodded. "I've heard rumors about Graves for years. He was a powerful occultist obsessed with immortality. If he's still out there, if he's become something other, then we need to stop him." "Clara said there's a book of rituals in his mansion," Elliot said. "Something that can stop him. But I don't know what I'm dealing with. I need your help." Dr. Cross hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll help you. But we need to be careful. If Graves is as powerful as you say, we're walking into a trap." The two of them spent the next few hours preparing. Dr. Cross gathered supplies, herbs, candles, and protective charms while Elliot researched the Graves mansion. By the time they were ready, the sun was beginning to rise. The mansion was a sprawling, Gothic structure, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The air around it was heavy with a sense of foreboding, and Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They entered through a broken window, the interior of the mansion as decayed as the outside. The walls were lined with portraits of the Graves family, their eyes seeming to follow Elliot and Dr. Cross as they moved through the house. They found the library on the second floor, its shelves filled with ancient, dust-covered books. Dr. Cross began searching through them, her eyes scanning the titles with practiced ease. After what felt like an eternity, she pulled a large, leather-bound book from the shelf. "This is it," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "The Liber Noctis, the Book of Night. It's one of the most dangerous grimoires in existence." Elliot's heart raced as he took the book from her. It was heavy, its cover embossed with strange, twisting symbols. He opened it, the pages filled with intricate diagrams and text in a language he didn't recognize. "We need to find the ritual that can stop Graves," Dr. Cross said. "But we have to be careful. These rituals are not to be taken lightly." As they searched through the book, the air in the room grew colder. Elliot could feel something, a presence, watching them. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. Finally, Dr. Cross found what they were looking for, a ritual to banish a powerful entity. But as she read through it, her expression grew grim. "This is complicated," she said. "We'll need to perform the ritual at the factory, where Graves' power is strongest. And we'll need a focus, something connected to him." Elliot's mind raced. "The phone," he said. "The cursed phone. It's connected to him, isn't it?" Dr. Cross nodded. "It's possible, but using it in the ritual could be dangerous. It could draw his attention directly to us." "We don't have a choice," Elliot said. "We have to try." They left the mansion and drove back to the factory, the cursed phone and the Liber Noctis in tow. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the industrial park. As they entered the factory, the sense of dread grew stronger. They set up the ritual in the chamber beneath the trapdoor, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly in the candlelight. Dr. Cross began to chant, her voice steady and strong, while Elliot held the cursed phone in his hands. As the ritual progressed, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Elliot could feel something vast and ancient, stirring in the darkness. The phone began to ring, its shrill sound echoing through the chamber. "Answer it," Dr. Cross said, her voice urgent. "But be careful. Don't let him take control." Elliot took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Hello?" There was a long pause, and then a voice came through, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "You dare to challenge me, mortal?" Elliot's heart pounded, but he forced himself to speak. "Alistair Graves, I banish you from this world. You have no power here." The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills down Elliot's spine. "Foolish child, you cannot banish me. I am eternal." The shadows in the chamber began to swirl, coalescing into a dark, humanoid figure. Elliot could feel the entity's power pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. But he held his ground, clutching the phone tightly. Dr. Cross's chanting grew louder, her voice rising above the chaos. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the air crackled with energy. "Now!" Dr. Cross shouted. "Break the connection." Elliot slammed the phone down, the sound of the receiver hitting the cradle echoing through the chamber. The dark figure let out a roar of anger, its form beginning to dissolve. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and then, with a deafening crack, the entity was gone. The chamber fell silent, the air still and heavy. Elliot collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Dr. Cross knelt beside him, her face pale but determined. "It's done," she said. "He's gone." But as Elliot looked at the cursed phone, now silent and lifeless, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Elliot sat on the cold, damp floor, his hands still trembling as he stared at the cursed phone. It lay inert, its once mysterious aura now replaced by an eerie stillness. Dr. Evelyn Cross knelt beside him, her breathing heavy but steady. The ritual had taken a toll on both of them, but the weight of what they had just done, or attempted to do, hung heavily in the air. "Is it over?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Cross hesitated, her eyes scanning the room. The symbols on the walls had faded, their glow extinguished, and the oppressive presence that had filled the chamber was gone. But something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too complete. "I think so," she said finally. "The ritual should have banished him, but with entities like Alistair Graves, it's hard to be certain. His power was tied to that phone, and we've severed that connection. At the very least, he's been weakened." Elliot nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He picked up the phone, its surface cold and lifeless. "What about Clara? Is she free now?" Dr. Cross sighed, her expression somber. "If Graves was holding her in some kind of limbo, then yes, she should be at peace. But without more information, it's impossible to say for sure." Elliot's heart ached at the thought. Clara had reached out to him, trusted him to help her. He needed to know that she was truly free. But how could he be sure? As they left the factory and stepped out into the night, Elliot felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The cursed phone was silent, but he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. It felt like a relic of the nightmare he just lived through, a reminder of the darkness he'd faced. Over the next few days, Elliot tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. He wrote up his findings for his article, though he left out the more supernatural elements, knowing no one would believe him. He visited the Historical Society again, this time to leave a copy of Clara Bennett's photograph and the handkerchief he'd found in the factory. Felt like a small way to honor her memory. But the cursed phone continued to haunt him. He kept it in a drawer in his desk, unable to bring himself to throw it away. Every time he walked past the drawer, he felt a strange pull, as if the phone was calling to him. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. One night, as he sat at his desk working on his article, the phone rang. Elliot froze, his blood turning to ice. He stared at the drawer, his heart pounding. It couldn't be. The phone was disconnected. It shouldn't be able to ring. And yet, the shrill, mechanical trill continued, echoing through the quiet apartment. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the drawer. The phone sat there, its receiver vibrating with each ring. Elliot's hand trembled as he reached for it. He didn't want to answer, but he couldn't stop himself. "Hello," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, and then a voice came through, soft, trembling, and achingly familiar. "Elliot, it's me. Clara." Elliot's heart leapt into his throat. "Is that really you?" "Yes," she said, her voice filled with relief. "It's me. I'm free. Thanks to you." Elliot sank into his chair, a wave of emotion washing over him. "Clara, I'm so glad you're okay. I was worried I hadn't done enough." "You did enough," Clara said, her voice gentle. "You saved me. But there's something I need to tell you." Elliot's relief was quickly replaced by unease. "What is it?" "The phone," Clara said, her tone serious. "It's not just a connection to the past. It's a conduit. A doorway. And now that you've used it, you've opened yourself up to other things." Elliot's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "There are other voices," Clara said. "Other souls trapped between worlds. They'll try to reach you, Elliot. They'll call you just like I did. And if you answer, it could be dangerous." Elliot's mind raced. He thought back to the ritual, to the way the phone had seemed to come alive in his hands. Had he unwittingly opened himself up to something far greater and far more dangerous than he'd realized? "What should I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You need to destroy the phone," Clara said. "But it won't be easy. It's tied to you now. It won't let go without a fight." Before Elliot could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind reeling. Destroy it? How? And what would happen if he tried? The next morning, Elliot called Dr. Cross and explained what had happened. She listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "If what Clara said is true, then the phone has become a focal point for supernatural energy," Dr. Cross said. "Destroying it won't be as simple as smashing it with a hammer. We'll need to perform another ritual, one to sever its connection to you and to the other side." Elliot nodded, though he felt a pang of fear at the thought of another ritual. "When can we do it?" "Tonight," Dr. Cross said. "Meet me at my house. We'll need to prepare." That evening, Elliot arrived at Dr. Cross's cottage, the cursed phone tucked into his bag. She had already set up a makeshift altar in her study, complete with candles, herbs, and a small silver dagger. "This ritual will be different from the last one," Dr. Cross explained as she lit the candles. "We're not banishing an entity this time. We're closing a doorway. And that means we'll need to be careful. The phone won't want to let go." Elliot nodded, though his hands were trembling. He placed the phone on the altar, its dark surface reflecting the flickering candlelight. Dr. Cross began to chant, her voice low and steady, while Elliot focused on the phone, trying to block out the fear gnawing at him. As the ritual progressed, the air in the room grew colder, and the candles flickered as if caught in an unseen breeze. The phone began to vibrate, its surface glowing faintly. Elliot could feel something, a presence, pushing against him, trying to resist the ritual. "Focus, Elliot," Dr. Cross said, her voice urgent. "You need to break the connection. Visualize the phone shattering, the doorway closing." Elliot closed his eyes, trying to concentrate. He imagined the phone breaking apart, its dark energy dissipating. But the presence grew stronger, pressing against his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. "I can't," he gasped, his voice strained. "It's too strong." "You have to," Dr. Cross said. "If you don't, it will never let you go." Elliot clenched his fists, focusing all his energy on the image of the phone shattering. He could feel the presence fighting back, but he pushed harder, his determination overriding his fear. With a sudden, deafening crack, the phone exploded, shards of blackened plastic scattering across the room. The candles blew out, plunging the room into darkness. Elliot collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Dr. Cross knelt beside him, her face pale but relieved. "It's done," she said. "The connection is severed." Elliot nodded, though he felt a strange emptiness inside. The cursed phone was gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That he had changed. The destruction of the cursed phone brought Elliot a fleeting sense of relief, but it didn't last long. Over the next few weeks, he found himself haunted by strange dreams. Visions of shadowy figures reaching out to him, their voices whispering in languages he couldn't understand. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the echoes of their voices lingering in his mind. Dr. Evelyn Cross assured him that it was normal. "You've been through a traumatic experience," she said during one of their meetings. "Your mind is processing what happened. It will take time, but the dreams will fade." Elliot wanted to believe her, but the dreams only grew more vivid. In them, he saw Clara Bennett standing in a vast, empty void, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. She would reach out to him, her lips moving as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. And then, just as he would get close to her, she would vanish, leaving him alone in the darkness. One night, the dream changed. Elliot found himself standing in the abandoned factory, the cursed phone in his hand. It began to ring, its shrill sound echoing through the empty space. He answered it, and Clara's voice came through, clear and desperate. "Elliot, you have to help me," she said. "I'm not free. I'm trapped. Please, you have to come back." Elliot woke with a start, his heart racing. He sat up in bed, his sheets soaked with sweat. The dream had felt so real, so vivid. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was still out there, still trapped in some kind of limbo. The next morning, he called Dr. Cross and told her about the dream. She listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "It's possible that the phone's destruction didn't fully sever the connection," she said finally. "Or perhaps Clara's soul is still tied to the place where she was trapped. Either way, we need to investigate." Elliot nodded, though he felt a pang of fear at the thought of returning to the factory. But he couldn't ignore Clara's plea. He had to help her. That evening, Elliot and Dr. Cross returned to the abandoned factory. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist as they moved through the empty space. They descended into the chamber beneath the trapdoor, the symbols on the walls faintly glowing in the light of their flashlights. Dr. Cross set up a small altar in the center of the room, placing candles and herbs around it. "We'll perform a summoning ritual," she explained. "If Clara's spirit is still here, we can bring her forth and help her move on." Elliot nodded, though his hands were trembling. He watched as Dr. Cross began to chant, her voice low and steady. The air grew colder, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. Elliot could feel something, a presence, stirring in the darkness. "Clara Bennett," Dr. Cross called out, her voice echoing through the chamber. "We summon you. Come forth and speak with us." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the candles flickered and a faint mist began to form in the center of the room. It coalesced into the shape of a young woman, Clara Bennett. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Elliot," she said, her voice faint and trembling. "Thank you for coming back." Elliot's heart ached at the sight of her. "Clara, I'm so sorry. I thought you were free." Clara shook her head. "I'm still trapped. The ritual you performed weakened Alistair Graves, but it didn't destroy him. He's still out there, and he's holding me here." Elliot's stomach churned. "What can we do?" Clara hesitated, her expression somber. "There's one way to free me. You have to destroy the source of his power, the altar in this chamber. But it won't be easy. He'll fight back." Dr. Cross nodded, her face pale but determined. "We'll do it. But we'll need to be careful." They moved to the stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Dr. Cross began to chant again, her voice rising above the growing tension in the room. Elliot could feel the presence of Alistair Graves pressing against him, threatening to overwhelm him. "Focus, Elliot," Dr. Cross said, her voice urgent. "We need to break the altar. Use the dagger." Elliot picked up the silver dagger from the altar, his hands trembling. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the stone, resisting his efforts. But he forced himself to focus, to channel all his energy into the task at hand. With a sudden, deafening crack, the altar shattered, its pieces scattering across the floor. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the presence of Alistair Graves was gone. The chamber fell silent, the air still and heavy. Clara's form began to fade, her expression filled with relief. "Thank you, Elliot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm finally free." Elliot's heart ached as he watched her vanish, her spirit finally at peace. He sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. Clara was free. Alistair Graves was gone. Dr. Cross knelt beside him, her face pale but relieved. "It's done," she said. "You did it." Elliot nodded, though he felt a strange emptiness inside. The cursed phone was gone, the ritual chamber destroyed, and Clara's spirit finally at peace. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that he had changed. As they left the factory and stepped out into the night, Elliot felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side, but the experience had left its mark. He knew he would never forget Clara Bennett, the cursed phone, or the horrors he had faced. But for now he was free, and that was enough.